Hello and happy Christmas. My name is Killian Garvey and I'll be talking about day 11, which is of course 11 pipers piping. This video probably says more about my lack of imagination, being able to shoehorn in planning decisions to Christmas songs than anything else. But as I'll be talking about pipers piping, I thought that I would talk about what developments are coming down the pipeline. Well, at least that was my original plan, but I thought that even for me that seemed a little bit too forced. So instead I've looked around and I've come across a decision, a development consent order approved by the Secretary of State in October 2020 for the Southampton to London pipeline project. Now, being a development consent order, naturally this was a substantial examination to this project, which lasted from October of last year through to April of this year. It involved 4 different examination inspectors and a huge amount of public participation and representation. In short, the development is for 97 kilometres of steel pipeline and the associated infrastructure to take a pipeline from Southampton to London. So the decision itself, the inspectors considered every discipline in planning, from noise to heritage to compulsory purchase powers to defence interests, and ultimately they concluded that there were only some landscape and visual impacts, but that all other factors were effectively neutral in the planning balance. Thus, the harm they identified was not sufficient to outweigh the national need for this project. There are 2 interesting facets that I'm going to talk about. The first is the question of alternatives, and the second is about Greenbelt. So the issue about alternatives was that amongst the alternatives that were considered was the alternative of doing nothing. That's quite an unusual approach, because typically when one is considering about alternatives in the planning sphere, you're normally considering about where else a development could go, or alternative ways at arriving at the same end result. But here, the Secretary of State endorsed the view that it was necessary to consider the alternative of not doing anything at all, and endorsed that as a legitimate alternative that needed to be considered. The other interesting facet is in respect to Greenbelt. So much of the pipeline is going to be underground, but there'll be some parts of it which will be above ground, including in the Greenbelt. So the applicant themselves had said that this constitutes inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, but their case was that very special circumstances were made out to justify that development. Interestingly, the Secretary of State disagreed with that and concluded that much of the pipeline itself constituted engineering operations, and thus was one of the exceptions to development in the Greenbelt, so it was appropriate. Furthermore, the Secretary of State held that, being that the construction work was only temporary, this was a factor which led to any harm to the Greenbelt only being limited in nature. And it was interesting to me that in the Greenbelt discussion they said that this was only a limited harm, but in their overall conclusion they said, well, this is neutral in the planning balance. The lawyer in me is questioning how those 2 conclusions can be reconciled, because surely a limited harm, it can't be neutral in the planning balance. It surely must be way against the development, but I'm certainly not asked to challenge this decision, so I won't take that discussion further. Well, anyway, happy Christmas, and that's 11 pipers piping.